In part 1 I'd made all the panels for the box, made the holes for the ports and input socket, so now it's time to make some mounting plates for the ports. I'm going to make the plate for the USB-C ports first. I've got this spare heatsink, so I'm going to cut the aluminium pins off to use as the mounting plate for the ports. So after measuring it up, I trim it down to the size I need and then mark out the location of the hole I need. It's smaller than the hole in the wood panel as I plan to use screws to hold the ports in place. With all this marked out, I can use the Dremel to cut the hole out, and then once the waste is removed, I give it a bit of a filing, and as you can see here, it's a perfect fit. I'm going to temporarily tape the ports to the plate while I get it correctly aligned on the wood panel, which I am also taping the plate to the panel. With that done, I can mark the hole locations for the screws that will hold the plate to the wood panel. I follow this up with some filing to remove the burrs, and it's looking good. Now when I look back at footage from part 1, I realise that the sides of the wood panel are too close to the outside ports. So I'm going to file these outer edges with a curve to resolve this design oversight. It doesn't take long to achieve this, and another test fit shows it's good, so I give it a sanding after this, and I'm really happy how it looks now. The next step here is to mount the ports to the plate. However, I didn't have any bolts small enough. I needed M3 and I didn't want to use screws as the plastic is that brittle type. So the only solution here is to hot glue it onto the plate, which seems to be the logical thing to do. After applying liberal amounts of glue and letting it sit to dry, it's holding fast. I'm also going to put some black electrical tape over the outside of the plate, as this will hide the aluminium and make it appear as one black piece from the outside. It's really made it look a lot more professional like this. What do you think? Finally, I'll screw the plate onto the panel and I'm all done. Now it's time to move on to the USB Type A ports and mounting them. Starting off with the 4 ports that will be located on the underneath side. This is mostly the same steps as you've just seen, however these ports are made of a soft plastic, so I will be screwing these to the plate. I finish up by giving the edges of the hole a rounding off and sanding the panel, and it's looking quite nice. I'm almost ready to glue this recessed section together, so I assemble the pieces together to see how I'm going, and I remember that I need to make an access hole for the input power and USB-C cables to the main box. So I mark this out and then use a 25mm spade bit to make the hole. Before any gluing, I give all the outside facing edges of the panels a sanding and then a good blast with the air compressor. I glue and clamp the first 2 panels in place and leave them alone for a while I proceed to create the mounting plates for the 2 pairs of USB-A ports that are located on both sides. This of course is basically the same as the last process. I'll just make both plates at the same time by sticking them together. This will save some time and make them identical. The glue is now dried enough that I can proceed to glue the next piece in place, so I switch back to this task for a couple of minutes. Now while that glue dries, I can continue with the mounting plates, cutting the hole, filing it square, drilling the holes, covering it in electrical tape, screwing the ports in place, and giving the panel a good sanding. It's time to switch and do some more gluing of the recessed box. I apply some glue to the 2 side pieces and put them in place, followed by lightly clamping them horizontally, and then I use a scrap piece of wood vertically to apply downforce clamping to stop it from moving while drying. I leave this overnight and come back to find that it has dried perfectly. When placing the large panel onto the recessed box, I notice that one side is slightly lower and needs a shim put in place to level it out. So I go ahead and make a shim from some scrap wood, chiseling and sanding it down to the required thickness. I cut this in half and then glue them in place with a bit of overhang that I'll trim off later. Clamping it in place, I put it to the side to dry. Next up, I need to mark out where the power supply is going and mount it in place. I'm going to locate 15mm from the top of the box, which leaves a 5mm gap between the top panel and the power supply. After marking out the center location on the board, I turn the power supply over and double side tape these 4mm strips of red gum to the underneath. I'm doing this as there are some ventilation fins on the bottom corners and I want to raise it up a bit to promote airflow. To mount the power supply, I'm going to use this angled aluminium. It's just the right height for the mounting holes on the side. I'll be making 4 mounts, but before I cut them, I drill the holes needed for the bolts and screws. After that, I cut them using my hacksaw and then file away all the rough bits. Now it's time to mount the power supply to the board, so I bolt the mounts to the power supply first. I have these button head screws that are a little longer than what I want, so I'm using 2 washers to prevent the screws from coming through the outside face of the box. Once screwed down, it feels very sturdy, exactly how it should be. The front panel will need some ventilation holes for the fan and also the fins located at the bottom section. I've decided to roughly mark these out on this greaseproof paper and then use some tape to help transfer this location onto the front of the face so I can drill them out. I use my punch to indent the wood where I need to drill and then proceed to use the drill press to make all the holes. Using a small round file, I remove the waste between the holes and then use a half round file to smooth the inner surface and make them look round and curved. I finish it off with sandpaper and I'm really pleased how it turned out. My freehand camera skills aren't the best, but you can see how the holes have lined up nicely. Now it's time for my biggest oversight so far. I plan to do the same thing for the lower air vents, and after marking it out and drilling all the holes, when I was filing it out I realised that there was no strength here in the wood and it simply fell apart. Well, that's one way to learn about grain direction in wood. Anyways, I decided here to simply make these into 2 large square holes and staple some fly screen mesh over the holes and be done with it, which turned out okay, and in the end it still allows nice airflow. At this point, I think it's a good time to wrap up this episode. Stay tuned next time where I do all the wiring, put the box together, and fingers crossed it all works as planned. As always, my projects take longer than I anticipate, but that's just how it is. Does this happen to you too? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, bye!